What is going on, you guys? It's your boy, the Brick-layin bitch here, and we are back with episode 157 of the video game therapy series. Yes, I am up here just laying bricks, pretty much. It is, I don't know, I do tend to like these kind of very repetitive, boring tasks throughout the world. I think some people think this looks crazy, and I understand it does seem crazy, at least on one level, like why I would even decide to build something like this, much less follow through. But I just do find like there is some peace in just the monotony of building these things. And I think that does kind of tie into an idea that I have about um, just about freedom in general, because I do kind of think it's a fundamental desire of humans to want freedom in some way. But I do think the way we find freedom, or the way that beings feel free, is still up for debate. I think people see freedom and immediately think of some like America hot dogs, burgers idea of freedom, or just like I should be able to do whatever I want. And they kind of also take that to mean like gluttony or hedonism, which I don't really think is a fair view of freedom either. But it's hard to point exactly to like what exactly is good freedom and bad freedom, because I would say like even on the front of like I don't know, sexual liberation or something like that, there certainly are like good amounts of freedom where we're not like hanging or ostracizing gay people or whatever, because it's we see it as more normal now. Whereas I think some people take that to the extreme, meaning that I should be able to like fuck a 10-year-old or something like that, because you can't tell me what my limits are on the freedom. Or I think most people, again, that are reasonable, and maybe this is just an Overton window thing of like people see the gay person like, all right, that's a reasonable thing to include as like this, we should promote freedom. But then it's like, all right, the freedom of a pedophile, it's like I mean, like, yeah, it's just like I get that the word pedophile is just a derogatory term that we have created to to categorize people, but in some other way that I think people feel very wrong about that, and they should. So I don't know. It's true with all that. Like, where does one even find freedom? But um, going back to me building the stupid pyramid, I think one way to find freedom is in just like I'll say like freedom is discipline, or like being disciplined is very freeing in some way, and that may seem like like the opposite conclusion that one should arrive at, given that like when you think of somebody that is disciplined, you're thinking of people that I don't know, get up early and stick to a routine or do something the same way, or they even find like they even discipline's almost synonymous with like monotony of like, oh, it's boring, because if it's disciplined, it is necessarily like like eating a lot of vegetables, where it's like that is considered a disciplined thing, because it's like, okay, just vegetables aren't that fun to eat. They're not really, besides the condiments and stuff that people dip them in, or chocolate covered vegetables, which is a crime. But in general, vegetables aren't that much fun, but like they're boring to eat, and people don't really, boring's not really fun to talk about. Um, so I'm kind of saying the equivalent of like, oh, the most fun diet to eat is just like a bunch of vegetables. But I think part of that misses the point of what I'm trying to get at, which is it's the piece isn't necessarily what you're putting on your plate in this metaphor. To extend to the more broad metaphor, peace is found from within and is not found in your day to day circumstances. So when you have discipline and you've just kind of decided that, like, all right, I'm just going to do things this way from now on, no matter what, that kind of gives your mind freedom to go, okay, well, I can stop making decisions on whether or not I'm going to eat this ice cream, or whether or not I'm going to do this or that, or to exercise or something. Like your mind's kind of already, made up if you're a disciplined person. So you have more time. That kind of is the argument around freedom, is you can be more free because your mind is not preoccupied with decisions that usually weigh heavily on, an ordinary person's conscious. Whereas if you just have made decisions already, you're kind of freeing up that mental bandwidth. But and I realize the decisions are always like kind of boring, fun ones. It's like or like not fun ones. So it's like, okay, should you eat the ice cream? No. It's like there's never a scenario where the answer to that isn't just like a very plain, boring, like, no, you shouldn't do that. That's not a part of your plan. Um, so I think people see that and they're just kind of frustrated. Like, well, that doesn't seem like fun. How is that freedom, or how is that? But again, I think it misses the point. The point is that freedom, or true freedom, is found within yourself, and is not something you're going to um, win or get that way. But either way, I got kind of got in that mindset after building these giant pyramids, which there is quite a bit of, I'll say, unintentional math behind behind this specific pyramid. But so I kind of came with the idea to build a pyramid out here just because I felt like I don't want to be the dirty kind of capitalist that just that just ravages an area for its resources and then just kind of destroys it and leaves it underground. Because I've already kind of done a number under the ground in this world. Like I've dug up a lot of the area over there, but I've also mostly filled those caves and caverns with things. So in the effort of trying not to let this become an eyesore any bigger, I'll make what is arguably a bigger eyesore in this giant pyramid. But there was some unintentional math. So I didn't really think about the dimensions, but obviously because I wanted to be a pyramid, I knew it had to be like a perfect square. So I just chose kind of arbitrarily 150 blocks, so 150 by 150, and then there's like a 10 or 15 block perm over there on that side, or berm, whatever you want to call it. But 150, and then I was like, well, not that I was thinking of history really when I started this, but like it'll be funny. It'd be interesting to at least like try to build this in the same manner that they built the Great Pyramids, like one brick at a time. This is where all the tinfoil hat people think that there's like alien conspiracies and things. So I was like, okay, well maybe I'll just design something brick by brick and build it in a modular way. And so at 150 blocks, I figured the modules could be 3x3, and that seemed like brick enough. That could be kind of, or cube enough, I suppose. They're not really brick shapes. Usually brick shaped, we think of like I don't know, like a standard red clay brick, whereas bricks could technically just be in squares here, but bricks I just mean squares here. But yeah, and then so it being 150 blocks, each brick being 3, makes it there's 50 blocks on each kind of on each edge. So then I got thinking about how to calculate like the number of total blocks that I would place, just because my mind wanders as I'm building this, so it's not like I can just think of literally nothing. I guess that is kind of the goal, is to be in some kind of flow state where I'm not really thinking about nothing. I was in terms of the flow state. I do feel like I do hit it sometimes when I do these things, and it's only when I feel like I'm trying to speed run like the actual act of me building. So like if I try to get faster and faster with each time I like put down one of these cubes, because I feel like I certainly have gotten much better since starting. But either way, it being 50 bricks across, each being 3, I kind of I tried to think about how many bricks in total I'd have to lay. So of course, being the loser, moron autist I am, I opened a spreadsheet, and I guess I could have just done it in regular Python, but just did a little like Excel sheet to see like how many bricks would be on each layer. And I know it's not, I'll say it's interesting, but it really shouldn't be. It's just kind of it's just a product of math and just how math works. But on like on a pyramid that begins on 50 layers, and going up, this next one's 50, that's 48, 46, because you're taking one off each side. That going all the way up will result in a pyramid of exactly 2,500 bricks, which I just thought was a very, again, it's not really a coincidence, because that's literally just how math works. It's not like I didn't discover anything. It's just math. Literally, the math just works out that way, and it just wasn't something that I had really had come to appreciate. The beauty of triangles or whatever. But I also noticed that in powers of 5, they were also very clean numbers. So I think if I built a pyramid like the first 5 layers, so 2,500, or because there's going to be 25 total. If you take 50 and you take 2 off each time, there's going to be 25 total layers. So if you just count the bottom 10 layers, it's like exactly 1,600. Then the bottom 15 layers would be like exactly like 2,100, and then I think with only 5 layers left, it's exactly 2,400, and the last 5 layers of this are exactly 500. So if I build like this same pyramid but only 5 layers, the top 5 layers, I think it'd only be 100. It'd be exactly 100 stone blocks, or 100 of these little building blocks, which I just thought was an interesting thing. There's also secondary ways that you can get to that number. So the actual first way that I arrived at this wasn't just using Excel. I actually represented this as one face. So I tried to think of one face of the pyramid. What would it be? Well, it would be a triangle, with like 49. I couldn't count this edge twice because there's one on that side too. So if each face gets one of these edges, it'd be like 49, then 47, summed all the way up to 0. So it was actually a summation. It was 4 times, so there's 4 faces, 4 times the summation of 2n minus 1, where n goes from 1 to 25. Meaning those are the number of layers, because there's 25 total layers, and then 2n minus 1 gives it the exact. Either way, that was the original math that that I wrote down. I literally wrote it down to like think of how long this was going to take, or not even how long it's going to take, just how many bricks would I have placed by the end of it. Because I mean, it wouldn't matter how long it takes. I've done stuff that has taken much longer than this. Again, for no reason. It's not like I'm doing anything for any greater purpose, but I did think it was very interesting how all this math works out. I guess you don't really appreciate it that much unless you look for it. And I could have easily just have said, well, this is just an arbitrary. I just picked an arbitrary shape, and it's Minecraft. Everything is blocks. But occasionally, especially when I'm working with circles in this game, I do find that I'm like, oh, this is actually really cool how this works out. And it's like I'm just describing like the property of pi, or like, even infinity has really kind of like broke my brain a couple times thinking about just infinity. And I don't think we appreciate like our genius to the extent that we should. And when I say our genius, I just mean like the collective happenings of mankind. I'm not saying any individual person's genius, but just the ingenuity of our entire species over our, even just over the last 100 years of our existence has been impressive, to say nothing else. But even just like concepts of like 0 and infinity that we just kind of throw around and not really think anything of are very like significant and difficult conceptual ideas. Like for the longest time, 0, and I'm obviously describing like pre-industrial societies. I'm not saying that somebody could have made a steam engine without the concept of 0, but like the concept of 0, while it comes very naturally to us given our, I guess, like our Western education background, the concept of 0 itself is a difficult thing for people to grasp, even intuitively. Because even 1 divided by 0, which is this concept of infinity, is also almost like a conceptual impossibility, given that we don't really work in ways of 0 or infinity. Like that, we can kind of conceptualize like the lack of something, but even the lack of something is not necessarily 0 or necessarily nothing. Regardless, for the longest time, I guess historically, some societies had numerical counting systems. Like they were obviously like pre-Pythagoras, but they still had counting number systems to keep track of. You can even think of this like in terms of Egyptian or old ancient, like pyramid math essentially. But they didn't have a concept of 0, and that, doing math without the concept of 0 is a difficult. It's probably easier conceptually because you're not working with something that, again, I would argue the human brain doesn't really understand. Same with infinity. But at the same time, it makes, what are ultimately simple, things of computation for us now, because we have 0, into things that seem almost impossible. It's like, all right, well, in order for us to actually go about multiplying or adding these numbers, the sense of scale just becomes very difficult. Like, so unless you're working with very small, single digit numbers almost, once you get into a context beyond like of scale, where it's like 1, 0, 10 is essentially like 10 ones, or like a magnitude above, just a bunch of ones. Which again, I realize all this sounds like complete nonsense because it's like, well, 0 it makes much sense to us because you've always been taught 0, but 0 didn't really always exist. And so people literally did math without the concept of 0, and they still were doing like, what we would call legal math in our time. They just literally didn't have 0. It's just I don't know. It was interesting thinking about that. Clearly, we have 0 now, and I have 0 other important things to be doing because I'm building a giant pyramid and thinking about I guess ancient Egyptian math. But either way, still stuff that is interesting to me. I had this other theory, I'll say. It's not even really a theory. I guess you could call it a theory if you want, but it's just like something I've noticed, and kind of I guess you can call it a theory. But it's this idea of like this relationship theory. It's like when I look at people that are couples, and this is just like, you could interpret this as like a weird sociopathic thing, but it's like I'm really just observing the social condition. I think having social observations doesn't make you a sociopath, right? It's just, but I think overly just dissecting them and kind of maniacally interpreting them in like selfish ways can be sociopathic. But just observing social tendencies and cues is not, just makes you annoying or Larry David, not a sociopath per se. Either way, with relationships, my theory is that I think people pair up or match with people that they think that they deserve to be with. So I'm sure you've seen relationships where you're like, all right, these people aren't really, again, not that I'm out here grading people or that I'm the judge deciding who's worthy of what, but like clearly one person in this relationship is, dare I say, just better than the other one. And it's always like, what is wrong with them? Like, why do they not see, maybe like the problems of this person or how much better they are, or if they're like out of their league, it's like, well, how do they even get to this person? Why is this other person like allowing this? Like, why is this the case? And sometimes it's just like, yeah, love gets in the way, and that's just what it is or whatnot. But I also think there is it's also just circumstance. I'm not saying that in every single case, unabashedly, this is always people always are with who they deserve to be with. But I think just in general, people I think aspire to be with and chase after people that they see themselves deserving of. So if you see somebody that, why is it, am I out of slabs? No, I'm not. Um, so if you see somebody that is with somebody that is like below their league, so to speak, I think you can, instead of viewing that as like this person is stupid or is not, doesn't see their value or something, or I think it speaks more of like to an ego issue, or just like a self interpretation problem than it would be like an actual intellectual issue. Like they might know that they're better than such and such, but there's an ego block somewhere that kind of, I don't know, points them in the direction to think they deserve a person like that for some reason. I don't know. It's just interesting, kind of putting that. And you can also see the opposite, where it's like people that shoot way up out of their league somehow. It's like, all right, this person, like those are the people that with the true like out of the truly like dangerous egos. I'll say like the person settling for someone else. I don't really view that as like a dangerous place because they're more safe and maybe they're just kind of unable to see their own value or something like that, or just don't really appreciate how great they are. I'll say. But then people that shoot for people way above their league or think that they deserve people that are like so much better than them, I think those are the real like egomaniacs to say, because they don't really have a decent grasp, or that they think they, again, not to plot people on some social hierarchy axis, but and it's not just money either. I'm just like I think people, in terms of like there's so many other things, and this is a secondary. I guess I'll just move into this topic right now because I'm thinking about it, but there are so many other like better ways to like conceptualize and consolidate value into than like currency. I'll say money as more of a, I guess currency might be the abstraction, money where it's like is the actual thing. So like then money. And what I mean by that is that money's value, even throughout like a lifetime or just the course of 10 years, like the actual value of money, which again is, some philosophers would argue, is nothing. But if I could even say like the value of the US dollar, for example, like that, the value of that is so fickle, based off of like the market. Like what was the value of the dollar, however many years ago, or and even people that, economists that would argue that it has been like US currency is an incredibly stable asset or, thing or whatever. I would still say it's still even the acquisition of money, like how money is acquired. Like you once was, I'll say like an industrial culture. It's like, or an industrial economy where the economy was based off of like industry. And now it's like to this weird, like almost to this, I almost want to say it's like an influencer economy where I feel like the only people that I know, or that I can even see of that are doing very, very well, that have like genuinely achieved this, source of like financial well-being and freedom, have been fucking influencers, not fucking rocket scientists, not engineers. Like I know all these unemployed fucking engineers and like, genuinely very, very smart people, but yet like the people who, went all in on advertising or, I guess, venture capital being another sink. are doing very, very well. But regardless, like I don't know, the economy itself used to be based off of industry. Now it's more, now it's like a loose, influencer economy. But just the value of money just changes so much, and how, you know, uh, like how you're supposed to get money to then be valuable. So if money is what's seen as like, or is the primary thing seen as valuable, and you don't really know what you're going to have to do to acquire said money. So like, suppose in 10 years the only way that you can actually get money, uh, you know, like comparably to how you get a money through a job today, is to dress up like a monkey and run around and pass out bananas for some influencer, like, essentially like Mr. Beast. Like, everyone's a contract worker of Mr. Beast, essentially Uber driving around, burritos or whatever thing he wants for his thing, where it's like, it's almost a humiliation ritual of getting money. The entirety of a job is just kind of undergoing this constant humiliation ritual of, oh, you need money? Here, do this, dance like a monkey. Um, and I'm just not. I just think there's better ways to give value to your own life and to decide that your life has value besides the amount of progress you're making towards, I'll say, are just like, fickle financial goals. And I'll say that you shouldn't have goals that are based in money, but I just think those goals, especially now, are going to be very, very volatile. I don't really see those being consistent, because even like the value of like $100,000 or even a millionaire. So like $100,000 in 1940, that would have been like life changing money. Like, and yeah, I'm not saying I would turn down $100,000 or that wouldn't be life changing money. It could be, but like I think 100,000, a million is a new $100,000, per se, and then the new $1 million is like a billion. Because even, I mean, again, not to sound like a complete idiot here, as somebody without $1 million, but $1 million really isn't that much money. Again, I understand the irony. I don't have $1 million. I don't have anywhere close to $1 million. But I think if you really ask people like who, what they want to be financially secure and stable, it's really not that much money. It's not much you can do with that. And yeah, obviously it's still life changing if you don't have it. For someone like me, I'm sure it literally would be, life changing amount of money. Um, but it is, and it's still just not nearly what it once was. And so not only like am I making comments against the inflationary tendency of currency, because over time, the currency always kind of goes up, or at least it always has gone in our lives. And I don't see inflation as a strategy, as an economic strategy, going away. Like I still think the clowns at the Fed, they're going to continue to use inflation, as one way to control the economy. Um, and that being the lens that I look at it, I don't view it as that valuable or useful to be hoarding cash. I think as any wise man knows, the last thing a wise man will hoard will be cash, because they know it doesn't represent anything, in the end time, so to speak. Which I'm not saying we're close to a societal collapse or an apocalypse, but I view like I'll say like the culture's grip, because the other thing is just about, I guess, culture in general. Because I was even thinking, like in the context of, I was like thinking in the context of like stand-up comedy, but just like people trying to make references. Like if I had to make a reference for people my age, I'm not even sure I could come up with something that I think everyone would get. Like I think I'd either have to like go kind of speak incel for a second and like come up with some, red pilled thing, or speak libtard. It's like I either, and not to say that our culture is divided among party lines, because it isn't. There are sects throughout, but I don't think there's not any agreed upon underlying culture. Like people either, like, they're very diametrically opposed to even, pop fans like Harry Styles or Taylor Swift. Like those are not like figures that everyone's going to understand references of. Most people in my friend circle have not heard of anything that Taylor Swift has done at all. Besides knowing that she exists, they don't know any of her music or anything like that. It's not the same as whereas I think, most people back, in the Beatles age or Pink Floyd or something like that, all they shared a lot more of this idea of culture, and they didn't. There wasn't so much disconnect. You could make like a Pink Floyd reference or something, and be confident that no one's gonna be like, "What the fuck is this guy talking about?" Whereas if I made some reference to something, there's a good chance I feel like most people would be like, "What the hell is he talking about?" Like because I even make references to stuff. I bring up like MK Ultra to people, and they're like, "What is that? I've never heard of that." And I'm like, really, I feel like this has to be common knowledge at this point, but it's not. And I just don't feel like, instead of, me taking blame on myself, of course, I don't think there is any really like common thing that everybody in culture understands and follows and knows. Because even brain rot, that stuff changes every month. So it's not like people that even know brain rot or follow it would, are going to be on the same page. They're not. If anything, they pride themselves on being on some completely random, like wacky, wavelength. Which is why I've said before, I think culture has become like schizophrenic, where it's like schizophrenia as a brain condition is like, an explosion or an overactivance of dopamine. And there's a whole problem with the whole chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. But regardless, schizophrenia being like too much dopamine essentially being fired into your brain and you just kind of seeing everything as something that it's not. I think that is kind of what culture is described as. Like every time anything happens, there's conspiracy theorists always pulled into their conspiracy. There's political movements and environmental movements to kind of shift everything into that lens. And like I said before in the last episode, like whatever your lens is, you can make some lens, to see the world through, whether it be like a cynical, a political, an economic lens. You can make like a rational argument through every lens to defend literally everything. Like if I made purely economic arguments, I could create very, dare I say, like, racist or communist like, environments. Whereas like if you have like these racist glasses on, you can see literally any action as being, pro or anti-racist, where it's like, all right, but you're kind of assuming that the people making decisions are also viewing every decision they make through this racism lens. Most people don't make decisions on that basis. Same with like an economic thing. Like, yeah, someone could make a boneheaded economic decision, or just like, consumers in general make boneheaded decisions where it's like, well, obviously they're not making these decisions rationally based off of this agreed upon, I'll say economic philosophy, or this social philosophy of, racism driving everything. Which I'm not saying there isn't anything that's racist or economics is pointless. They are obviously very, very powerful explanatory philosophies. But the idea that like every single thing is somehow rooted in like racism theory or something, I think is silly. It's like, I think there's a time to say, all right, this kind of feels like something that could be judged on the scale of racism. And there's also a time to be like, all right, I don't think racism has anything to do with this. We can just, we can kind of forget about that right now. But like, I think people are so quick to like want to connect dots with things, and have realized that like, well, if you are clever enough, you can manipulate any piece of data to represent any conclusion that you want. So there's not really a point. It's like, all right, well then fine. But that also kind of makes it pointless to do half this shit, right? If we kind of know that, you can argue your way around anything. Because everything is technically. You ask a lawyer, it's like, well, is this legal? It's like, all right, well, it depends. Who are you? Like, what have you done? Like, do you know the judge? We could argue this, we could argue that. It's like, all right, it's not. There's never like it's just not that simple. It's not. Yes, this is always illegal, or oh, this is always illegal. It's like, no, well, kind of depends. There's a lot of factors at play, and that's just the way everything is now. But either way, I do think we live in a very kind of, I'll say, schizophrenic esque culture. The other thing, just about, I guess, getting people on your side of things, because a certain amount of living in the world is, generating what are your ideas, or what you will claim to be like your core ideas, your identity, or your values, whatever you want to call it. And then it's like, then it's a matter of, okay, I've decided to, at least temporarily, if not permanently, believe these things, X, Y, Z, whatever. Um, and then it's like, all right, well, I obviously believe these things because I think they're right, or they're good, or they're somehow in the interest of everybody. And then it's like, all right, well, how do I get other people to echo and believe these same things that I do? And I think I tend to recognize a few different categories of how, I guess, different people go about trying to get other people to believe in their things. And I think I've noticed the biggest difference between using what I say are like methods of fear and control versus like invitation. And not to say that it always, like, you can't ever use like the fear of something bad happening to motivate behavior, but like I think most people know, who are at least marginally skeptical of the efficacy of tax dollars, know that like the government has used child porn and terrorists and the war on drugs to do literally everything horrible that they've ever done. So the idea that like, just because there is something people could fear, like they should fear, or that fear is always like an okay, or is even always like a bad thing to make decisions on, isn't necessarily the case either. I think there is times to let, I'll say let fear, let control guide behavior. Control is, I guess, a little less acceptable than fear, but I think in general, people are too often just guided by things that scare them or things that, are like using leverage against you, but meaning that like control versus I think a more powerful way to, I don't know, I guess to get people on your side is through, is through invitation or kind of inviting and showing people how nice it is, So, this is one area where I think Linux kind of screws up a little bit because I'm unabashedly like I guess, a Linux fanboy, I suppose. But it does have a tendency to be a little gate kept. And I realize that there's also a second side to this where, like, yeah, our Linux users pretend to be better than you and are elitist and whatever. Part of that is justified. And again, not to sound too much like a Linux user, part of it is justified to me at least, because of not only its obvious superiority, uh, but but also I realize that being abrasive and being difficult is unfortunately a effective defense mechanism against retards ruining a good thing. Because I think the other thing is people notice that good things can only really be enjoyed by like a minority. So even like I don't know, something cool like vinyl collecting like that I think was cool at one point when it was like a minority fringe cool thing to do. Now it's like that's not minority anymore. That's not a fringe thing. That's not cool because everyone's fucking doing it. So in the same way, it's like I think part of the strategy of being a Linux neckbeard is like, all right, we're going to be hostile and annoying to people who don't have like the patience or attention to detail to learn how to use their own fucking computer. So it's like, yeah, read the fucking manual. I'm going to be a dick to these people. And it's not that like you're deterring these, Windows users away because they're evil or something or you're a dickhead. I think part of it's like, okay, well, if you're gonna, if you're gonna enter into I'll say like our collective realm of computing, where we have rules around, which are essentially like nobody owns this. Commercialization is generally like seen as a bad thing, And I'm kind of describing like, I guess your stereotypical, autistic Linux dude. Those are just kind of like hyper libertarian views, kind of abrasive style, kind of the actually thing. And again, many of these things aren't necessarily desirable in their own right, but they serve a very important defense, mechanism to not ruin what they see rightly, as a good thing. I think, I do think Linux is a good thing, and it will be ruined, just like anything else, will be ruined by idiots that come in here and try to set up apps and other bullshit and end up commercializing it into some other thing. We've already seen a fair amount of that effort being put into by Red Hat and Google and stuff like that to try and own the Linux part of it. But there are still the reason we can still enjoy Linux is there still are a strong minority of vocal neckbeards that are very autistic about their rules. And I think being on, I've come more and more around on this idea of like being super autistic about rules is, might actually be a good thing. Same with like, even like the discipline of eating ice cream or something. It's still like you almost want to be like autistic about it, where you're like, no, I cannot do that. And it's like, well, why? It's because because I have made. It's like they've made some invisible pact with the Lord. It's like I cannot do this. That's just not. It's a violation of my moral integrity. Whereas I think people don't really have those lines anymore, and especially as religion is seeing its way out, and people just kind of throw that out now. Don't religion's gay or whatever. It kind of leads people to accept, what some might call like a culturally relativistic, moral stance on things, where it's like we cannot judge the morality of two separate cultures against each other, like no matter what. Like we can't say that American culture is better than, I don't know, Indian culture or something like that. Like we can't say that. And it's like, okay, well, if we can't judge any basis of any culture, then it's like, all right, then we're not any better than like African warlord culture. It's like, I guess technically then by that kind of rule of reasoning, that technically is true. So we can't say that African warlords have it worse or they're, it's like everything is kind of relative to everything else. So you can't make any objective measurements. Whereas I think some people, myself included, would make the argument more so. It's like, all right, well, we can't really. That's kind of a stupid way to go about things. I think no matter whether or not you can make it like, I'll say like perfectly rational why you think American culture is better than like African warlord culture. I still think like, you know, someone needs to make that call and saying that one is preferable to the other. Because I don't think, you know, if we disregard that and nothing can be better than anything else, I think that becomes a not only like a logistical issue of figuring out what's preferable to not, because then you can make the argument that like, well, poverty is actually a good thing, so you can't say that someone being in poverty is bad. Whereas you know, people aren't that stupid, but you know, in general, they don't. You can't make moral judgments about why you think something would be better than something else based off of using it based off of like a different culture or location, or certainly not something like race based. Obviously, I think people know that. You know, stay away from that. But you know, I just think it's dangerous to not have any. I'll say like moral guidance or just moral like direction with this. You know, given that religion has, you know, is kind of being shooed out, you know, again in favor of kind of this, I guess, everything is good, we can accept everything, you know, that kind of philosophy. So it doesn't, you know, make moral judgments about things. But I think part of the reason that, you know, historians especially have noted the importance of religion is because it provides kind of this culturally agnostic moral direction. Whereas I think without kind of some, and you could say it's top down, like the church gives moral directions, but I think also in general, people themselves also then tend to guide religions as well. Like I don't think there's religions that were always like every religion that has a book, the book has been amended like 40 times. So so it's not even like a book itself means that the religion is never going to change with, you know, people's, you know, taste and people's selections. Like even Christianity like is obviously not by the book in most Christian things. It's like there's tons of these different flavors that it ultimately I think developed as, you know, as cultures and societies progressed. I think it's fair to say that, you know, we're probably a little bit of different peoples than, you know, they were, you know, way back in, you know, 200 AD or something like that. Or, you know, back when the Bible could be taken more literally. So, but it's not to say we should, you know, have modern amendments to these religions all the time. But I think people do find, you know, modern ways to adapt, you know, historical wisdom into, you know, a way that, you know, modern peoples can use it. Uh, and that's important only because I do think there's not many other ways that we are venerating our, I guess, our ancestors in some way. So I think all of their wisdom, because part of what history is supposed to do is, you know, at least documenting history is, you know, because why are we writing anything down? Why are we documenting history? I think we're doing that because we want to at least like see what happens when, you know, try to notice patterns in behavior. You know, it's like history often repeats itself, or does repeat itself. And there's another quippy side quote to that I can't really remember. But you know, we study it because it's supposed to teach us lessons, you know, or bestow upon us wisdom throughout, you know, times of generation. Religion was one way that peoples passed down, you know, their wisdom, and they didn't always do so directly. Like I think now when we think of wisdom, we just think of like scientific knowledge, which again, it didn't always used to be like wisdom wasn't always so overlapped with our concept of like intelligence or like computing or brain power. Wisdom was more of like a quiet a quiet power that didn't really answer to any authority. It wasn't like who is the source of wisdom. It was not like, well, this scientific machinery is our source of wisdom. It's like, no, the source of wisdom is this guy just like listening to himself and being, you know, truthful, which I realize is less potent or, you know, sounds less cool than like, you know, our religion is this $1 billion microscope. Like that's, you know, that's essentially our, you know, that's what we treat as our God. You know, that sounds more powerful than just like some dude sitting, you know, under the, you know, under a tree flipping an apple up in the air. You know, that's how I'm depicting the philosopher. But I think that also misses a lot of, you know, who's been right, like who actually is, like, yeah, science has been right about a lot of, you know, I'll say very tactical questions, but like the deeper questions of like how to live or like what to do with your life, science still has terrible answers for that. So if you're looking at like, well, this scientific machinery is our source of wisdom, it's like, no, the source of wisdom is this guy just like listening to himself and being, you know, truthful, which I realize is less potent or, you know, sounds less cool than like, you know, our religion is this $1 billion microscope. Like that's, you know, that's essentially our, you know, that's what we treat as our God. You know, that's who's right. It's like, okay, well, who's right depending on what questions you're asking. Like, who's asking what question? And I think as people kind of move away from these very materialist questions, how many miles is it from Fort Lauderdale to St. Louis? Instead of going from that direction, we're focused on very practical, tangible, numerical things. People are kind of turning into more, they're having more spiritual questions. Or like, why the fuck are we here? What am I doing with all this shit? Why are these things? And science has always been terrible at answering that. It kind of always answers it in a very, and I've joked before, like I say it's like a suicidal type answer where it just basically tells you it's like, oh, you're worthless, kill yourself, no one cares. Um, so I won't say that, that is, that's everything, but I do think that is where scientific thinking, to a fault goes is ultimately not into a very, I'll say, helpful place. So, while it might seem, I'll say, smarter or cooler to be on the side with the laser, I think being on the side of the, lone philosopher under the tree, you'll have more of your metaphysical questions answered. And I think even just it makes a greater point just about religion as a whole. I think a lot of people assume religion is like based off of belief, which I'm not saying it isn't. I think there obviously is, belief is an enormous part of religion. But I think another kind of lesser appreciated dimension of religion the is like the actual like belief, like believing in something, uh, or just like commitment to said belief. So it's not even that they believe in this because it's something that they have scientifically witnessed without a doubt, and they can't questioning it would go against their ideas of what they know is truthful. But it maybe sometimes more accurately reflects like a commitment to a certain set of value structures and not necessarily a commitment to a set of rational or logical facts. So I think that's where most people fall off with religion now is they're like, well, it's just not logical or rational, to believe X, Y, Z, or like how in the advent of science could I reasonably believe that thing, which again I defend as like as a scientist, understanding that like I'm not going to accept that you know that the world is 100 meters wide. It's like I'm just never gonna or whatever. I'm not saying that's the claim that any religion makes, but I'm just rationally cannot run around saying that is something that I quote unquote believe in, or as part of my value system. But I think a new religion, one that will eventually come in that I don't think it might be a whole new flavor, but I think there will be kind of a new religious revival. But it'll have to be something that divorces our scientific rationality from our like moral decision making or our like value systems. Something that divorces again strict logic with value, as something that will eventually come in to replace our concept of religion. Because I don't think our society or our culture can exist for too much longer without kind of these Again, I'm not saying when I say religion, people just think of Christianity. That's not exactly what I mean either. I just mean without some kind of unifying religion, because that was the other thing that Christianity or just religions, not in Christianity, religions as a whole, what they did is they again provided something in common that I could like, something that again to make a stupid example, but like something that a stupid stand-up comedian could make a joke about and be like, okay, everyone's going to get that because everyone's on at church on Sunday or something like that. Which again is not what I'm saying. That hopefully there might be a third place with it or not or something like that. But I think that it does at least give us a cultural backbone because we don't really have a cultural backbone. At least not one that isn't heavily stratified. I guess the other thing I was thinking of with regards to like culture and things changing was, I think whatever like, because even though I'm thinking a lot about history again, just because I'm rereading the lessons of history for like the 10th time, and I'm gonna read it again because I just think there's a lot of wisdom in there I have to actually get out. But every time I read it, I only get a little bit because it's so dense. But it talked a lot about this like almost like hemming and hawing and this like this ever this ever going pull between what, for lack of a better word, I'll just say communism versus capitalism, where it's like inequalities among men are normal and are going to capitalize, and the people who can do more or are more capable should get more, and everything should be attributable to the amount of effort one puts in. And then it's like there's a ultimate revival. It's like, well, no, things need to be equal. You guys are hogging all the resources. Fuck you. You're greedy. And then it's like, and it goes to communism. Like, fuck, this doesn't work. People aren't equal. You guys are all lazy. You should work for your. And so it just goes back and forth between, revolts and communism, revolt capitalism, revolt communism, and I think it just goes. It's almost a never-ending, cycle of things. But in thinking about just that kind of ever-going cycle, and you could make arguments to as where we are on this cycle between communism and capitalism. If I had to guess, I'd say we're probably going to swing more towards communism in the next 50 years before we have another kind of explosion of uh, you know I'm sure there's a better communism and capitalism kind of make it seem like they're economic philosophies, but again I try to view it more strictly philosophically. So I think like libertarianism versus like egalitarianism, whereas like everything is equal versus everything is like freedom based. There's almost just this permanent back and forth between like freedom and utopia, or like economic utopia and like a libertarian's idea of freedom, freedom to do whatever. But either way, I was thinking about like people that are protesting or are doing like essentially any kind of anti-government or anti-establishment things. At some point, sometimes throughout history, the governments are capitalists. An anti-government thing is a communist thing, whereas other times, the government is communist and the anti thing is a libertarian or a capitalist thing. So it's almost just like this constant back and forth. But I obviously don't get involved in a lot of this stuff on the day to day, only because it's almost impossible to know what history will say about this point in time. But to the extent that I do get involved, I do think it's always worth thinking about like what are actually effective means of protesting. And I think like the modern, hopefully this is not, it's not too mean to say it this way, but the modern manifestation of like these parades that people, all get in line and have pickets, fences, and like or like picket signs that say, whatever. I don't know that that is really an effective means of doing anything. I don't like. I think if that really worked to like change these politicians' mind or like change people's minds, I don't think they would let us do that. And, in the sense that like if they actually did, if writing "fuck you" on a cardboard box and spending 4 hours outside, yelling at cars that are driving by. It's not even like I'm at this person's house. I'm just like, who am I even yelling at? Who's supposed to get mad at this with me and like do something? I just don't think it's an effective means of protest. I think like the more effective means and the ones that I have a tendency to do anything about are like these more sly, um, uh, kind of like technology based solutions to things. So like, I don't know. For example, if you're worried about like free speech, like yes, I could put on an anonymous mask and drive around Capitol Hill and throw eggs at people or something like that. And yeah, like sure, I might get somebody saying, well, this clown is running around, violating people with eggs, talking about like free speech or something like that. Or I could just actually, I'm not gonna say vote with my dollar or something, that corny, but just vote with use the free the technology that supports my belief systems. So it's like, all right, I'm just going to use technology that promotes freedom and is designed in such a way that it's impossible for this not to be free, or at least in your or to violate. It's like I'm not putting my faith in a human that is fallible, that's going to have a sex scandal or something. I'm putting it in like programmable technology that is in at least in this context, much more reliable than humans. To be, it's not going to like have a mind of its own and change. The only thing it really does is like software licenses with things, but beyond that, like if I've committed to a piece of software and its license is copyleft, I'm not really that concerned with like it's I know it's a freedom promoting piece of software, and that by using that I am promoting and kind of supporting concepts that I believe in. I don't think dressing up as anonymous and throwing eggs at people is effective. And I think at one point it probably was, like with wars and things. I think like politicians were much more like shaken up by their populace in the streets rioting. But I think politicians now just don't give a fuck about riots. Like they don't think like people parading around the street with, they don't care. Like that's not going to bother them. Like you need to actually think about things that you could do or strategies that actually would bother them, that would either hurt their bottom line or would make whatever they're doing more difficult. So like even if some stupid politician passes some gay law that, is some identity verification thing for online, it's like, all right, one thing I could do is to get mad and go, hey, you shouldn't do that, and then just like yell at them, while they're sitting in their floating house or whatever. Or I could be like, all right, what are technologies that I could use, or how could I like break what they have? Like, how can I get rid of this DRM? How could I use freedom promoting things? Like, all right, I'm just so fine. They're gonna put force. They're gonna apply pressure to me this way. The way I'm gonna apply pressure back isn't by making a sign and being mad and like it's like, all right, what can I actually do to like fuck up their thing? Like their agenda is to get all the money and the information out of me. Okay, my agenda is for you to get no information and no money out of me. But me protesting or like posting on social media gives you more information and my like time that you didn't earn from me. So it really does nothing to further my bottom line. But like me using technology that fucks up your agenda and doesn't give you my information or my money or my time, and it's easy for me to manage, like that's actually how I protest. So I do, I'm not a political person, but in the ways I do make political statements are through the technologies that I use. Because again, my position on most things politically is always like, well, I don't know where this is. It doesn't seem like it's all the information. We never have all the information until it's like 5 years after the fact and no one cares. But like anytime the story is hot off the press, we never have enough information. We don't have the victim's case. Some guy just got accused of rape. It's like, all right, even if why would I come down hard on this guy if I really don't know for sure? It's like, well, the evidence is damning. It's like, all right, but fine. But I've still been like, that has still not, I'd be stupid to go out on a limb and just immediately condemn this guy. We don't really know. We don't know. I know I'm sounding like I'm defending the guy, but he might be the one that needs to be defended soon. It's like, yeah, like we shouldn't like immediately assume guilty. I don't know. We should just leave it to the legal system. Why are you asking me about this? I don't care. All right. Well, anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Finish my pyramid. So I'm pumped about that. And yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching. Peace out. Fuck.